Hello, everyone. Welcome to the show. Before we get started, I just wanted to remind you that for updates on the show, be sure to follow me on Twitter at OmerQ_. Again, that's at OMERQ_. And if you like the show, please consider supporting it by subscribing on Apple Podcasts or following the show on Spotify so that you get notified when a new episode is released. Also, be sure to send it to your friends. We don't ask you to give us money, just support the show by helping it grow. Just a few easy clicks. That's all it takes. It doesn't cost you a dime, and you can do it in no time. So please consider doing that, and let's get to the show. Hey everyone, I'm Omer Qureshi, and welcome back to Omer 2020, the RNC edition. Today we're going to be talking about the fallout from the Republican National Convention, as well as the latest polling in some key swing states, and we take a look at the election from the perspective of a moderate former Republican. Joining me to do all that is a master's graduate of political science from Cal State Northridge with experience in studying political parties and ideologies, and he's also one of my best friends in the entire world, Alex Ramos. Alex, how you doing, my man?
Hey, Omer. Yeah, it's good to hear from you. Good to talk to you. And I'm really glad to be here this morning.
Yeah, and by be here, you mean through Zoom because we can't meet in person anymore.
Yeah, social distancing by maybe 600 miles.
Yep, little incompetence went a long way. So I just wanted to start off by getting your reaction to some of the latest polling. National polling right now has Biden up right about 7 points. And the latest national poll comes from Morning Consult, and that has Biden up by 6 points. And we've seen that Joe Biden has been consistently either winning by 10 or 9 points, or he's been within 4 or 5. And that's something weird. It's a very large disparity because you don't really see him much in the middle of that. So I just guess based off of that, what's your initial reaction to some of the latest national polling we've seen?
Yeah, so from the polls I've been looking at, I'm seeing the same picture you are. For example, when it comes to the general election, polls from CNBC, The Hill, The Economist, they tend to have Biden up by 8-9 points, sometimes as low as 6. But I think one key thing to remember from 2016 is that many of these same polls had Hillary up by 8-9 points or with a several lead. And look how that turned out.
Actually, I just want to switch gears because, while national polling is nice and all, it's not an exact science, and you should always take national polling with a grain of salt. In reality, Trump only really needs a handful of states to actually win this election and get another 4 years in office. So national polling, while it's nice, it's a gauge kind of where the nation is at. If you want to look at who's actually going to win, I think state polling in these key swing states is important. Let's start doing that by looking at Michigan. Now, Michigan, there hasn't been a ton of polling until recently. There have only been 3 polls since the end of July, and the first 2 had Biden up by 4 and then 6. But in the latest poll by the Trafalgar Group, Trump is actually up by 2 points in Michigan. And just so you guys know, the Trafalgar Group was the only political polling institution that correctly predicted Trump's win in Pennsylvania and his lead in Michigan last time. There's also polling out of Wisconsin that shows that Trump has narrowed the gap between himself and Biden. Again, the Trafalgar Group ran a poll there, and he was up by 1% in Wisconsin. He's also narrowing the gap in Arizona. It's down to 2. He won a poll there. Biden still won, I think, 2 more polls after the RNC, but they were only by a margin of 2 and 4 points. Florida, very similar deal. Biden is leading, but his lead has shrunk. And Pennsylvania, Biden's lead has been very consistently at about 5 points, and we haven't really seen a huge shift in that. Latest poll from Morning Consult there shows Biden with a 3-point lead. So given all that, it seems that overall Trump is narrowing the gap in a lot of key swing states that he needs to win because, like I said before, Arizona and Florida are 2 states that Trump needs to find a way to keep. And Arizona, especially with the demographics changing in the way that it is, it's important that Trump keeps that. So I guess what's your reaction to some of these state polls that we just talked about?
Yeah, I think the biggest part when looking at these state pollings is, as you said earlier, with the national results, is you need to take them with a grain of salt, because if we look only at national polling data, Biden, seems to have the election in the bag. But once you start getting to the nitty gritty of these battleground states, you look at Michigan, where Biden's only up by by 2 points. Pennsylvania, he's up by 4, but Trump, like you said, is narrowing that lead. And keep in mind, and back in 2016, Trump took Pennsylvania by less than 1% of the vote. In Minnesota, they're currently tied right now. And back in 2016, Clinton took Minnesota by about 1.5 points. So when you look at all these key states scattered throughout the entire country, ranging from the East Coast to the Midwest and the South, the picture is a lot murkier, and there's definitely a lot of indecisiveness among the people. And I think that's what really strikes me is that, sure, the overall population may disapprove of the president, but that's not the real picture.
Yeah, as we know, the Electoral College is set up in a way that essentially the election is going to be decided amongst 5 or 6 key states. So you actually mentioned Joe Biden, and you actually mentioned his reach out to moderates earlier, and I just wanted to give you a quick tidbit about that. Perhaps the most interesting thing that I found was in a YouGov poll, the national poll, YouGov national poll had Trump actually beating Biden amongst independents. So that's registered independents who aren't affiliated with either the Democratic or Republican Party. And Trump was up by 10 points. He was beating Biden 44-34. And that poll was released right after the RNC, the last day of the RNC. And that makes me kind of question, I guess, Biden's whole strategy of trying to appeal to moderates and if that's working. Because as we saw during the DNC, Biden was not able to first consolidate support within his own party, within the Democratic Party. I think that that's something that's hurt him. He's gone all in on the strategy of trying to sing kumbaya with the moderates, and we don't know if that's being necessarily as effective as it can be. And this polling, Biden has been actually, I'd right around tying or below Trump in a lot of these independent polling scenarios. And that just makes me question this whole strategy that the Democrats are going for, which is let's appeal to independents, let's appeal to moderates, and let's try to consolidate that vote before we consolidate vote within our own party.
That's, I think, is one of the most fascinating parts of this upcoming election. And we'll, hopefully we're going to see how things play out over the next couple of months. So for those of you that don't know me, Omer mentioned in my introduction that I'm a former Republican. Quick background, like I'm a Puerto Rican, my family's from Puerto Rico. And I would say definitely my mother's side, we're about 95% Republican, always have been. But none of us actually really appreciate the president. In fact, if you look back at the data in 2016, Marco Rubio ran away with the Republican primary in Puerto Rico. He just ran away with the entire thing. But personally, I've always been center-right of the line. I interned with the Republican Party Los Angeles County for a year, but I've also only really ever voted Democrat here in the state of Virginia. I voted for Warner, Kane. I did vote Barbara Comstock over Wexton, but I did vote for Ralph Northam. And so to give you an idea of where I lie politically, I did identify as a Republican, but I'm a very moderate issue. And so I guess to give my opinion as a moderate to this whole Biden thing, after watching the Democratic convention and the Republican convention over the last couple of weeks, if I were to go in objectively speaking, I think the Republicans may have swayed solely based off Donald Trump's Jr. speech. For those who did watch or hear that speech, he was able to hit a lot of key talking points that a lot of people like myself appreciate. Things about job security, economic security, healthcare, welfare, immigration. But he also did so while still staying true to that Trumpist far-right ideology. And so that's where it gets tricky. A lot of voters like myself were kind of put off by the Democrats and Biden in the sense that there's a lot of this, I guess you could say, a lot of this like embracing of very, I don't want to say far left, but very leftist ideology, economic policies, social policies.
Wait, I'm sorry,
No,
but
go ahead.
I just have to interject here. So when you say bracing of leftist and left-wing ideology, I think a lot of people who are actually part of the left wing of the Democratic Party will probably ask you, what Well, like, what are you talking about? Because there seems to be a lot of or a little bit of pandering to some left-wing ideologies, but there doesn't seem to be, at least for a lot of people on the far left, me included, a lot of actual policy to back it up.
Right. So when I'm talking about these far left ideologies, and of course I can't speak on behalf of all moderates or independents, but from people I've talked to and stuff, I think healthcare is the best example. Um, I think everyone agrees without a doubt that healthcare is an essential human right. And previously, the biggest
I think, just to correct you, I think everyone believes that access to healthcare is human right.
Yes, sorry. Yeah.
I think the wording on that is important because there's a difference between healthcare just being a human right than access to healthcare being a human right. But I'm sorry.
No, you're right. Thank you for that correction. Access to healthcare is an essential human right. And I think where a lot of people like myself, where we fall short of Democratic Party lines, is that we just don't agree with the single payer healthcare system or a total like public free healthcare system on issues of physical policies. And obviously that's a whole discussion we can have. I'd be glad to have another time. But issues such as single payer healthcare. So personally speaking, healthcare is one of those issues where I tend to side more with the Republican side, and that I believe government does have a responsibility for the well-being and well-care of its citizens. And while, yeah, if you're a federal employee, you're a military employee, you have TRICARE, which is a government-sponsored healthcare system that is, free, paid for by taxpayer dollars. But I do think that when it comes to, I guess, so to speak, the rest of the market, private companies can create a competitiveness and range of services that would, in my opinion, cause severe financial issues for the government. Now, yes, private healthcare companies and insurance premiums are astronomically high, and there should be things to be done to take care of that. But that's a separate discussion. And so when moderates are looking at issues such as healthcare, immigration, and we weigh the two options between what the Democrats are saying and what the Republicans are saying, yes, on the right side, we have all this, to quote the president, Mexicans are thieves, rapists, criminals, which is not true. Sure, there is a small demographic that may have committed crimes and stuff, but the overall issue, as someone who spent 2 years in Los Angeles, has lived around the States a little bit, that's just not true. Everybody knows that's, it's overgeneralization and a stereotype, which is just wrong. But when you look at the state of the economy, state of the jobs, and you look how Democrats, not all, I agree, everything I say needs to be taken with a grain of salt. But this talk of opening borders for everybody, easing up the process, it's not appealing to us at this time. While I personally believe that this is a country founded by immigrants for immigrants, where everybody has a right to come in here legally and going through a vetting process. And while our process is not perfect, this is where I used to be Republican, in the sense that I wanted simply just a more streamlined vetting process instead of just letting everybody in. And that's what, politics used to be about. It's getting to the same end, just through different means. And now it's just pandemonium,
right,
and hearsay.
Right. And I think that that's an important point. And it's something that I think is, especially these days, given how polarizing politics has become, is a cliche. And it's very rare to actually find it. But I think that's why, like, you and me, our friendship has kind of prevailed all of this, because, I'm very, very left wing. I openly accept that bias in my beliefs, although I'm able to look at things objectively, I would like to think, when I'm analyzing them. I am pretty left wing. And then you yourself, you've said that you're a moderate Republican, but you and I have been almost best friends for the better part of 6 years now. I want to reach out to a lot of people I know that you can have people who politically disagree with you, and it could be fundamental political disagreements that People, they might not agree with you on the economy, healthcare, social security, a lot of important issues to you, but you can find common understanding amongst other issues, or you can find common understanding amongst just yourself as being friends. So I guess what I'm trying to say is don't let politics completely ruin your friendships with people. Yes, call out if someone's being a racist, advocating for injustice. Always call that out and take measures to help mitigate that. But don't let small, petty political disagreements ever get in the way of important friendships.
Yeah, and if I can just add on to that, like, in the 6 years I've known you, I don't think any of our worst arguments were ever political. You know,
I think our
we
worst arguments were probably about Model UN.
different kind of politics.
Very different kind of politics.
Yeah, but
Anyway,
like of all the conversations we've had over the years, I think our political conversations were the ones that were always the most engaging, the most constructive of our friendship. And this whole partisanship, I have some really good friends, some from California who disagree on me fundamentally on virtually everything. And sometimes those conversations get a little rough, a little out of hand. And so I want to join you, like just letting people know, you guys, politics has always been around. People will always disagree. And, sometimes one side has it right and the other has it wrong, and that flip flops. But politics should be a means, should be a way of getting to an end. And everybody should agree, everybody agrees on that end. We just disagree on the means. Politics shouldn't be what, in my opinion, it has become today, which is just both sides demonizing and antagonizing the other and creating this partisan divide. And, that's why I left politics. I had a very good internship with the Republican Party Los Angeles County. I've worked on political campaigns, on political issue campaigns, and I could have had a political career set up for me if I would have chosen it. And I feel many people throughout the country might sympathize with this, but this whole partisan and vicious antagonizing behavior is putting a lot of people off of politics who otherwise would have been very constructive towards our society. And I think that's something people need to, think about and remember what politics should be and not what it currently is.
absolutely. And hopefully in the next few months, we can kind of regain some of that understanding. And that's what I'm trying to do through this podcast and through the different various ways I'm going about approaching this election in the conversations I'm having. Let's move on to talking about the election from a strategic standpoint very quickly. So if you are Joe Biden's campaign and you are seeing, like, let's put on our political scientist hats and look at this objectively. You're Joe Biden's campaign. You're seeing that Donald Trump is getting up and he's catching up to you in several key states. What is the direction that you're taking right now?
Yeah, if I were a campaign manager or some kind of advisor on the Biden campaign, I think my immediate reaction would be, where are we losing those votes? Are people, what kind of demographics are shifting to Trump? And while I can't pull off that off the top of my head right now, I would assume many of those are working class people who have lost their jobs recently, probably, especially during the pandemic, people who, to be blunt, people who don't really care about social issues right now. People don't necessarily care about Black Lives Matter, not because they don't think Black Lives Matter, but necessarily because their chief concern right now is, how do I feed my child? How do I pay for their school supplies, for their school books? If my child gets sick, how do I pay for that? And of course, I can't recall everything right now, but I feel the Trump on his third night speech, he kind of appealed to that fear, that fear of not being able to provide for your family, and that fear of, he tried to assuage those fears and tried to reassure people that he would, if reelected, fix that problem. Whereas the Democrats, the biggest message they're giving out is about social issues, cultural issues, how there needs to be and how just Trump and the GOP are creating this racial divide in our country. And while people really agree with that, um, you know, people care about economic issues. And while, sorry for that tangent, I think that just ties into what's going on right now because of this COVID pandemic that's ravaging the country. I think Biden is losing steam in some of these key battleground states because he keeps on playing on these racial issues, these social issues. And from what I've read, from what I've heard so far, he hasn't really done much to address the economic aspect and the economic issues of this country. And so I would start switching that issue on what is he going to do different from Trump or better than Trump on to address families who can't afford to feed their children or can't afford to send their kids to school with proper supplies and materials. Those are the issues that I think Americans really care about right now. And I think that would be what I would be doing. I would start, I mean, I wouldn't say let's just ignore the racial issue going on in America. That's an issue that needs to be tackled. But frankly, the economic issues like that are what people care about because that's what people are losing sleep over today.
Right. No, I think you're 100% right. And just to put a bow on that, I think when Andrew Yang was running for president, when he started his campaign, he was a virtual nobody. His entire email list was his Gmail contacts. And he eventually ended up being one of the more popular Democratic candidates. And he ended up being on the stage as one of the last people on the debate stage with everyone who they thought had a chance. And nobody thought he would ever get that far. And part of that, I think, is because of his campaign's emphasis on the economy. He was able to get a lot of moderates and Trump supporters to actually support his campaign because it wasn't just a social campaign. It was a campaign that acknowledged the economic hardship, especially in the Midwest and Rust Belt, and he was trying to find ways to address that problem. And I think when you speak to voters about the economy, when you speak to anyone, you could be a Republican, Democrat, when you speak to them about the economy, you have a way higher chance of getting them to join your campaign or come to your side. And like Andrew Yang said, the best way, I think, to address this election and to get Donald Trump out of office is to address the problems that got him elected in the first place. So the problem isn't just Trump. He's just a symptom of that problem. He's the symptom of bad trade deals in the past. He's the symptom of outsourcing of jobs in the Midwest. He's a symptom of automation. He's a symptom of people losing economic security through all of these things. And I think going forward, it's extremely important for Biden to not just address that, but also come out with policy to support that. At the end of the day, that's what the American people want. They want financial security and they want security amongst their families.
Exactly, spot on. And, you know, if I may just flout my graduate studies a little bit.
Flout away, my friend.
Yeah. If you study the evolution of politics, not just in America, but particularly in Europe, you know, over the last century and a half, politics has predominantly been about economics because poverty in the 1920s is not like poverty today. You know, people who live in poverty today still have a standard of living. It may not be as good as the rest of the country, but, you know, poverty in the 20s, 30s, early 1900s, we're talking about destitute people with no means to provide for themselves or their family. And over the course of the 20th century, as the standard of living throughout countries got better and people were able to have access to education, healthcare, and become part of this political system, things slowly got better. And so during the 60s and the 70s, as the American economy really skyrocketed and, you know, everybody was living the American dream. And in Europe, people were living the American dream through robust economies and robust societies. The issue of economic issues no longer played a vital role because people weren't worried about, you know, going homeless, or people weren't worried about being hungry for the next 2 days because they couldn't find a job. And that's when we saw the rise of all these social issues, the Green Movement, anything that had to do with race, social, LGBT rights. During the 60s and 70s, if I remember correctly, that's when all these issues began to rise, because now that we were no longer worried about going hungry, we could go about tackling issues that affected our friends, our neighbors, our family. But now we've been going on this downward trend where people are now terrified again of not being able to feed their family, not being able to have a roof over their head. That's, those are concerns now. And all these social issues that the Democrats seem to be clinging on for a victory, they're being pushed aside by the mainstream of the American electorate, I believe. And so I think that's what the GOP seems to be on track of, and the Democrats need to really get more of a hold on that, is that, now in times of economic strife, the electorate has always favored economic issues over social issues. And that's just a trend you can see throughout elections over the course of the 20th century.
Let's step back and move on to the Republican National Convention. Out of the convention, it seemed the Republicans were pushing a few key points. And feel free to add any if I miss any. 1, Biden is a socialist. 2, the economy was strong before COVID. It was ruined because of things that were out of Donald Trump's control, and Trump will rebuild it again in another 4 years. And the Democratic Party have failed in inner cities. And there was also a huge emphasis on Christianity, on religion, Christianity mainly, and a lot of pandering to Christian and religious ideals such as freedom of religion, but it seemed it was only towards, like I said, Christian ideals, not necessarily freedom of religion for every.
You're exactly right. The opening night, that first night, those opening moments, there was this deep, strong Christian overtone, and exactly what you said. It wasn't so much freedom of religion in schools, but so much freedom of Christianity, so to speak.
I think that's very important to note how the Republicans did that and what that accomplished, because with all of those religious undertones and sometimes overtones, it was very clear that they were trying to consolidate Trump's base, that base of evangelical voters. Let's get them in hand right now. So moving forward, we can focus on other key demographics and other key people.
It's safe to say that the Republicans have a strong grasp on the religious vote in this country, at least the religious Christian vote.
And that's actually something that I noticed from the convention to compare to the DNC. The Republicans did a very good job of consolidating their already built Republican base, making sure that they're a unit going into the generals, going into the debate. And that's something you did not see out of the Democratic Party from the DNC. The DNC actually did a lot, whether it was indirect or direct, hurt their standing with the left wing of the party, because you had things the same week of the Democratic National Convention. You had things like AOC getting only 60 seconds to speak, and then the mainstream media and Democratic pundits criticizing her for not mentioning Joe Biden in her speech, even though, 1, she had 60 seconds, and 2, she was part of a nomination for Bernie Sanders during the roll call, which is tradition, and it always happens at every single convention, Republican or Democrat. If you get a certain amount of votes, you are automatically nominated as tradition, as a ceremonial piece of the convention. So they did things like that. Another thing that I know from a lot of people in the left wing of the Democratic Party that hurt them and I think ended up hurting a lot of trust, when Nancy Pelosi endorsed Congressman Joe Kennedy over incumbent Senator Ed Markey. Markey, of course, being a huge supporter of the Green New Deal and running for Senate in Massachusetts. Joe Kennedy is obviously from the famous Kennedy family, and it seems like bad politics. Everything that came out of the DNC seemed like strategically strategically wrong, because
it's just looking at the DNC, it's it's like you're saying, it's all bad politics. It was the strategic bumbling around. And I think it's because the Democrats just don't know they don't seem to know who they want, like who they want voting for them. They don't know who to pander to. They don't know what to pander to. They're juggling around. They're juggling around all these talking points and platforms, and they can't seem to pick and choose. And it's just causing them to seem such like a disorganized mess.
Right. And in the RNC, you saw a very clear, consistent emphasis on the same policies, on the same issues in almost every single speech. And let's actually get to some of the speeches that I thought were very important. Obviously, some of the more important speeches of the weekend were Don Jr., which you already mentioned earlier. From a political strategy standpoint, it was a very masterful job of campaigning for his father. And Don Jr. actually had one interesting note from his speech. He mentioned at one point when talking about criminal justice, we need to hold bad police accountable while at the same time holding criminals accountable. Now, it's very small, and I could tell that he's probably lying through his teeth. It was very small. You saw this constant appeal to very moderate ideals, because a lot of moderates are moderates for reason they're moderates on social issues as well. So while a moderate might not completely agree with the way that a group like Black Lives Matter or, completely condemning and defunding the police, they might not agree with that. They might also notice, yes, it's obviously a systematic problem that needs to be addressed. And I think, again, very small, but you saw it consistently in a lot of speeches, this appeal to very moderate and, sometimes even contradictory values.
Yeah, I would agree. Don Jr.'s speech that night was probably the most ear-catching, most eye-catching moment, in the sense that, well, personally, I don't believe a word he said. It looked like his lips were saying one thing, but his mind and thoughts were somewhere else. And that to me just says I don't believe a word he says, but how he was able to eloquently talk those points, exactly the quote I was going to bring up what you just said, how we need to tackle police brutality, but also hold criminals responsible. And then I'm paraphrasing this next part, but basically how we needed to welcome, new Americans, new immigrants, but also deal with illegal immigration. Now, he was able to have a foot on both sides of the line, so to speak. He was tackle police brutality, Black Lives Matter, hold criminals responsible, Blue Lives Matter, welcome new immigrants. We're a pro-immigration party. Illegal immigration. My minds go back to what has actually been going on with the Republican Party. All these immigration camps, so to speak, where children are separated from their parents, and so many horrible things going on at the border right now. But if going based off what he said and solely what Don Jr. was telling us on that podium, you would think that the GOP has a very precise, strong, and centralized platform to deal with all these issues that doesn't seem radical. And, and it doesn't seem super progressive. It seems it's like middle ground. It's in the middle. And that's what, moderates like me look for. And to be, perfectly clear, I'm, hands down voting for Biden in this upcoming election. But that key speech from Don Jr. is all I took away from the entire convention. That's all that I'm going to remember from this convention, is his ability to pander to both sides and make it seem like he's offering a compromise.
Right. The biggest thing that I'm going to take out, I think, is probably the emphasis on policy. Throughout the convention, the Republican speakers mentioned jobs, the payroll tax cuts, which were very popular in the Rust Belt, add trade deals that Donald Trump was able to get out of and then renegotiate, like USMCA, and even investing in things like HBCUs and in Black communities. So there was a lot of talk about policy, and I always think that, especially amongst independents and moderates, if you talk about policy, you're way more likely to appeal and get their vote than you would be through a social or very superficial appeal, something like that.
Absolutely.
And
Independents, moderates.
independence, yes, big time. Now, the other big takeaway I had is I kind of realized something. I realized how far behind the Democratic Party is from a political strategy standpoint. I kind of thought about it throughout the years, and I realized that if this was an Olympics, the Republican strategists would be getting gold, silver, and bronze, and Democratic strategists wouldn't even be placing. And you might disagree with me on this, but for me, the Republicans for years have been able to convince voters to vote for things that have always been against their best interest. So things like cutting Medicare, cutting Social Security, voting against climate change voting against climate change regulation. All of these things that hurt voters, take away benefits from them that they've been paying into, they've been able to make it so that voters see things from the complete opposite point of view and see things like Social Security, things like taxes for Medicare, Medicaid as bad things. And I have never been able to really grasp in my head. You have to kind of wonder, how are the Democrats losing when a lot of what they're campaigning for is, we're going to be giving you this. We're going to be giving you access to more healthcare. We're going to expand Social Security. We're going to hopefully get rid of carbon emissions by 2050. I guess what I'm trying to say, though, is how did we get to this point where it seems like the Republican strategist and the Republican message is so much stronger? It just resonates so much stronger because of how, I guess, empty a lot of these promises. Because at the end of the day, the Republicans are just going to say, by cutting taxes and giving you less benefits, and some of the benefits which you've already been paying into, you are benefiting from it. When in reality, you're taking away healthcare, you're taking away land that could be used for preservation or reservation of animals. It hasn't sat well with me how far behind Democratic strategy is from the Republican strategy.
Right. And yeah, there are definitely things first of all, I agree with everything you say, how the DNC overall has just always been behind. And I think part of that is a sense of arrogance. And the other part is, from what what I feel and from what I've seen over the last several years in American politics, is that the Republican strategy seems to focus on the individual. How is this going to affect you? What's going to happen to your life if this goes through? And obviously, they paint everything in this apocalyptic, nightmarish way, and that scares people. But the Democrats, they say they focus on the individual and, like, this is going to help you. This healthcare is going to help keep your parents healthy, your children healthy, and that's great. People like that. But the DNC also seems to offer this, like, vague, like, collective good, which, yeah, it's great. Society should be improved and worked upon. But they don't seem to really, like, touch upon the individual aspect. It's like, if we were to have two hypothetical candidates, a Republican and a Democrat, in the same room, pointing this, looking at a crowd, I would say the Republican is looking most people in the eye and, like, trying to reach out to them, and the Democrat is just addressing the crowd. I don't know if that makes sense.
You're saying that the Republican is going to probably give a more individualized and personalized message, while the Democrat is probably going to kind of pander to what they think the overall group is in favor for. Is that what I'm understanding?
Yeah, and that just seems to, kind of reflect what's been going on with the last years. The Democratic Party has always, in my opinion, has always pandered to what people are shouting about the loudest. you know,
Well,
the
I don't know if that's necessarily true though, because if you look at a lot of the loudest shouters from the Democratic primary, were Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren supporters, or more progressive voters in general. You know, they were shouting about free healthcare. They were shouting about Green New Deal. They were shouting about a lot of initiatives that are more popular amongst left wing members of the party, while the DNC openly came out against a lot of these ideals and saying that they would not support, and you saw it in the Democratic platform, they don't support Medicare for all, they don't support the Green New Deal. And, you know, it just seems like the Democrats are always more so kind of trying to appeal to a more corporate, moderate establishment level of politics. And something that I've always kind of said is that the moderate Republican policies of the Democratic Party from the past 10 years are what have led to Trump's fake populism. Trump has someone to point the finger to. Whenever he's railing against policies he says he disagrees with, he's always pointing towards the Democratic Party, pointing towards Obama, pointing towards Hillary Clinton, and now Joe Biden. He's pointing towards something that people have a lot of resentment for, and it's important that even as Democrats, even as people from politics, point that out, because it's just true. A lot of the neoliberal policies of the past 15 and 20 years have plagued the Democratic Party and given the Republican Party, and Trump especially, a lot of ammo to use, because these are things that have shipped jobs overseas. These are things that have automated away jobs. These are things that have led to terrible trade deals that are hurting a lot of people in the Midwest. And just to put a bow on this, I think the fact that the Republicans and Donald Trump are way more adept and are better at speaking to these issues than the Democrats, and better at speaking about policy than the Democrats right now, it scares
well, I
me.
wouldn't know about that. You
I
know,
mean,
I've
well,
seen
what policies
Cult.
have the Democrats been talking about? Give me any policy that Joe Biden has mentioned in the past 2 months.
No, no. What I'm going on is I wouldn't say that Republicans are, or at least going off of Trump. Trump isn't someone that really strikes me about policy. He panders to emotion and fear, but doesn't leave the policy to pretty much everybody else. And
No.
I'm
Part of his fear mongering is the policy that he wants to implement. Because even when he was saying those racist things about Mexicans and Muslims, what was his whole thing? Build a wall, ban Muslims. That was actual policy that he was trying to enforce. Whenever he's talking about bad trade deals, he's talking about trade deals like NAFTA that were negotiated by Democrats. Even when he's railing against the environmental regulations, he's always calling out Democratic regulation. So to say that he's not talking about policy, yes, while most of what he says is fear mongering and all of that, he's always somehow brought it back to what have they done wrong and what am I going to do right. And that's, I think, a very basic necessity of running a campaign, especially against someone who you know is stronger than you right now. How do you need to address what they've done wrong, address what their people have done wrong, address what their party has done wrong, and then say how you're going to fix that. And I think you're going to reach a lot more voters that way.
and I mean that's what we've been seeing with Trump catching up in so many statewide polls, and all this gap slowly closing in around the
Right.
Democrats. I personally have my mind made up, but there are thousands, if not tens of thousands, even maybe hundreds of thousands of people who haven't made up their mind. But I think if the Democrats don't, if they don't get their act together, so to speak, if they don't find some strong core platforms and policies to start, preaching out to their audience and to voters and saying, this is what we're going to do, or this is what we're going to do differently than Trump, instead of just like, we care about you and we want to do something, say, this is how we're going to help you. And you're actually right on how Trump, his basic uh, ramblings actually produce and provide insight into his policies and what he has, or has not done over the last couple of years.
Promises made, promises kept, right?
Yeah, I mean, hey, he built segments of the wall. He didn't build the wall entirely, but he can point to the border and like, look, there's, we got some of the wall there. We've been building the wall. Um, Look, we have a Muslim ban, and regardless of people's opinions on that, how many politicians can you look at in the history of our country who have kept so many promises that he's made?
And who have lied their way and manipulated their way into doing it. It is the fact that the race is this close and that Donald Trump still has a chance to win this election. It's very scary for me, as not just as a person in politics, not just as someone who's left wing. Very scary for me as a Muslim. I'm gonna be very honest with you. When the Muslim ban came out, when Donald Trump in 2015 came out and said that he has a plan to ban Muslims while he was campaigning, it's something that scared me. It's something that scared a lot of people in my family. Things like that. The fact that the Democrats have not been able to widen the gap, and the gap is actually narrowed. It's part of it, yes, is a lot of people are caught up in the cult of personality of Trump, but equally as part of that is the Democratic Party's inability to provide substantial policy changes and policy to help people and to convince people of that policy.
And here's what's so, to give insight to what you're saying. In my 2 years in Los Angeles, everybody, knows how progressive and to the left Los Angeles is. In my 2 years in Los Angeles, I've had hundreds of conversations with Uber drivers from all walks of life, from all ethnicities and religions. And what scares me the most, and it adds on to what you were just saying, is the amount of immigrants, Muslims, Hispanics, people who were Trump supporters. And, I was an intern for the Republican Party at that time of Los Angeles County. Personally, I was never a fan of Trump. I was a Kasich supporter, but seeing people who were immigrants themselves, who they themselves were ostracized by many members of the party they're supporting, how they support this man, and they all said the same thing. He does what he says he's going to do. He's not lying to you when he says he's going to do something. He goes out and does it, or does his best. And that's what they care about. Someone who gets things done, someone who's strong in his position of power to get things done. And it's terrifying to me.
It's terrifying to me too. The biggest thing about Trump, though, is that whatever policy he says he wants to implement, you can guarantee that he's going to fight for it. Some of that appeal that people have towards Trump is that feeling that they're voting for someone who's going to fight for what he believes in. And the sad part is he actually might not even believe in it. I think Donald Trump is a narcissist and only does and says things that will end up helping him achieve his own goals. Let's actually shift gears a little bit. I have some questions I want to ask you. So you kind of mentioned you were a Kasich supporter earlier, right? Did anything he said at the DNC, at the convention, influence you or change your views as a moderate for as far as deciding who you're going to vote for?
No, to be honest, I don't think anything that's really been said over the last few weeks has really changed my mind. And I think that's because I'm personally, as as a Puerto Rican, as someone who believes in a moderate policy platform and just common sense, and to be honest, from a personal perspective, I would never vote for Trump. And as seeing Biden as the only promising candidate apart from Trump, I don't think anything can really change my mind from that. That being said, I mean, you've always known how much of a Kasich fan I am. I think he is the hero we need but do not deserve.
Wow.
In the sense, and I mean that in the sense that I think Kasich is the kind of person I see running on the unity ticket, a Republican running with a Democrat. So
look, honestly, I've said that Joe Biden probably would have been more effective if the Democratic Party's whole plan is to appeal to moderate independents and moderate Republicans. Then they should have just gone for the unity ticket and had John Kasich run as vice president. Obviously there were other circumstances at play here. The Democratic Party didn't want to go in that direction, but they still want to promote, these appeals to moderates and independents. If that was your strategy, I feel like the most effective way was to get someone like a Kasich, or you can even go, you could be anyone else, but just a strong moderate conservative who has been an outspoken Trump critic, and that would have been a more effective strategy. Now, I guess based off of that too. So you mentioned that you interned at the California GOP, right, or Los Angeles County GOP, right?
Yeah, I was an intern for the Republican Party in Los Angeles County.
Right, and you were there after Trump got elected.
Yeah, I interned there from October of 2017 to October of 2018.
Okay, so you were there for about a year. So in that year time, did you notice anything regarding the cult of personality around Donald Trump within the place where you worked?
Oh, absolutely. So, first of all, from my experiences and from what I mentioned earlier, my Uber experiences, there's a lot more Republicans and Trumpists in Los Angeles than people think there actually are. And they range from the very poor to the uber wealthy.
Right.
And so, from my experience, I think the best way to address that question is looking at members who were on the executive board and are still on the executive board of the county party. There are people who I've had personal conversations with who confided with me, and I confided in them in private from the rest of the party, that we didn't agree with Trump. There are many things he said and he did that went against our personal beliefs and our personal tenets. It's a cult of personality. There were those of us within the party that did not like how things were being shaped, but many people just kept getting deeper and deeper in this Trumpism and this Trumpist cult.
And I think you and I have both seen that firsthand with some of our friends, and it's just sad. And from the outside looking in, it just seems that some people, whether they be politicians, voters, or otherwise, they might not agree with everything Trump says. They might actually think he's a liar, and they might agree with a lot of our criticisms of him, but they see him as a means to an end. So they have
Absolutely.
right. They have their
There is
policies that they want to get
fundamentally,
across, and they want to use Trump as a vessel to get to voters to gain power to get those policies implemented.
yes, there is one conversation I remember very well with a member, and they were telling me how he, how Trump was just a buffoon and a bambling guy who didn't really know what he was talking about half the time, and that how he didn't agree with how things were with many of the things Trump was saying. But it was better having Trump in office and agreeing with some of the things he was having done than having a Democrat in office where he didn't agree with anything the Democrat would have done.
Right. And it's weird because if you reverse the roles a little bit, it's kind of what's happening right now within the Democratic Party. Even people who think Biden is a fundamentally flawed candidate from the left wing of the party, when compared to Trump, they're like, okay, Biden is, we don't agree with Biden and everything he says, but he's definitely better than Donald Trump. And so it's kind of weird how that's kind of shifted in the past 4 years. So just wrapping up now, it's like, what's something you wish to see out of the current Republican Party that you're not seeing right now?
So I would say there are two things right now that I really wish I would see from my former party. Actually, I'll add three things, but the third thing is a personal. The first thing I want to see is them to actually acknowledge what's going on with the pandemic. I feel there are people in the Republican Party, and the convention did address COVID to an extent, but I think it's time the party opened up their eyes and acknowledge, over 176,000 Americans have died from this, and yeah, I will lay the deaths of many of those people on the feet of the Republican Party and how party leadership has ignored this and into the situation. But the second thing is the thing I really wish I would see from my former party, and it's just challenging Trump, standing up to him. We've seen in the Senate, senators, like McCain, rest his soul, people like him who we know don't agree with Trump and we know are against Trump and everything and many of the things the president stands for, but they don't stand up enough. I wish the party that I voted for and that I grew up believing in would drop all this populism and all this far right nonsense and start going back to what they used to be. I think I've mentioned this to you before in our conversations, but if Reagan and Bush Sr. were to run today based on what they ran at the time of, based on the policies they held in their times, they would be labeled socialists, Democrats, Republicans in name onlys, and they would be ostracized by Trump. And I just find that so ironic because when people think of Reagan, they think of a Republican icon.
Well, when Republicans think of Reagan, they think of a Republican icon. It's probably important.
Yeah, of course. But but I mean, when I say the name Reagan, you immediately think, oh, a Republican.
Yeah. Reagan to me is the epitome of what the Republican Party was before Donald Trump.
Exactly, and while I agree there are many things Reagan did that my family didn't agree with at the time, and that in retrospect in my studies I would have not agreed with at the time either. I still think that overall is a party that I belong to. The Reagan, the Bushes. Well, I'm not perfect, were politicians who I could vote and be proud of my vote, whether people agree with that vote or not. It's just funny that people who built the party and built up the image for better or for worse are the very same people who would be ostracized and cast out by the party under Trump. And I wish my party would change that.
Do you see that changing in the next few years?
No, not at all. I think one of the possible outcomes I think of this election is if Biden wins, instead of a Republican Party that's going to start dismantling itself and healing itself and rebuilding itself, I think what we're going to see, and I think Don Jr. really provided an insight into that, is a party that will then fight on and become a party of resentment for 4 years and let that resentment boil over in the next election. I don't, as much as I would like to see a dismantling of the GOP as it currently stands, I don't think that's going to happen.
Like, we can't even predict what's going to happen over the next 3 months. We can't really predict what's going to happen in the next few years.
And
So,
then currently, because I did mention it, the third option is I really wish the Republican Party would do more for the people of Puerto Rico, but that is a whole conversation for a separate time.
yeah, I'm actually going to have you and another Puerto Rican activist I know on for another episode to specifically discuss Puerto Rico, because I think that's very important. Given all of that, what is your message to moderates out there who say they don't know who to vote for in this upcoming election?
If there was something I could say to those people, the way I came about my decision is to be frank. The first couple of years of the Trump presidency, while I I personally can't stand hearing the president speak, there was a period of time in the early years of the Trump presidency where I considered voting for Trump again, given the alternatives. Um, but as time went on, and I implore all the other moderates out there and all the independents who are on the fence, is that look at the things the Republicans and the Trump administration have said and have done, and compare that to the Democrats. And we've talked extensively in this throughout this conversation about what the Democrats haven't done and what they've done wrong. I think, as much as I was talking about economic issues, this is a very moral election. You need to, think to yourself: are the Republicans really going to? Is Trump, rather, really going to provide a way out of our current situation? Is he going to provide a viable, competent solution? Because what we've seen over the last 4 years, we've seen solutions and we've seen policies, but were they really competent? Were they really in the best interest of our country overall?
Like one thing we've seen from Trump is people might think he's strong on the economy, but one thing you cannot deny as a huge critique of Trump is extremely, extremely at the forefront of this election, and should be at the forefront of this election, because whether it was COVID, whether it was the economic fallout from COVID, whether it was the situation that occurred earlier this year with Iran, whether it was a development in the Middle East, Trump repeatedly in times of crisis has shown his inability to really navigate through those waters. And that's where I think that this idea of, a lot of Trump supporters and backers will say that, oh, well, we like the fact that Trump is off the cuff and he says exactly what's on his mind. And while that might be appealing to some, reality is it's extremely harmful when you're dealing with sensitive issues that are going on, especially international relations issues and during COVID. When Trump goes out there and after Fauci has outlined exactly what we need to do to prevent COVID from spreading and to end essentially the disease within the United States, Trump goes out there and he contradicts his health experts. He contradicts Fauci. He says that Trump once said that he was hoping that everything could open up by Easter and that would be great and that's what they're hoping for. A lot of people who didn't see Trump wear a mask, who didn't want to really close everything down, I think a lot of Republicans especially took that to heart, and a lot of his supporters took that to heart. And I think that's led to a rise in the amount of coronavirus cases and, unfortunately, a huge rise in the amount of deaths. It's just important things to note going into this election.
And that's why I'm struggling so much to formulate a message, because to me, it's just the choice is between a man who has shown time and time again that he is corrosive and toxic to our American way of life versus someone who, yes, is not a perfect person, is not a perfect, will probably not be a perfect president, but someone who will actually work on practical, competent solutions, and someone who will actually provide a way forward instead of someone who will tweet hate and divisiveness at 4 a.m. I don't personally see much of a choice between that.
Yeah, and I think a lot of people would agree with you, and hopefully it can get to the point where the majority of people in those swing states agree with you and Trump can be elected out of office.
I just hope it doesn't take a disaster to reach that point.
Amen to that, brother. Alex Ramos, it has been a pleasure talking to you, my friend. Where can the people find you? Is there a cause or a message you want to shout out?
Yeah, thanks for having me. It was great having fun. And I really, I encourage people to go and research my home island of Puerto Rico, our relationship with America, what's been going on over the last 120 years. And, I really encourage people to try and connect. If you have any, friends or even family from Puerto Rico, talk to them, talk to us about what we've been going through and, what's been going on, and trying to help us bridge this divide that's been going on between the island and the state.
Couldn't have said it better, my friend. The overall treatment of Puerto Rico over the years has been very neglectful and terrible, and it's something that I think needs to be addressed sooner rather than later. Alex Ramos, thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you very much for having me.
And thank you guys for listening. This has been our RNC Fallout episode. Be sure to tune in next week for another episode outlining the major political news and developments over the next few days. Until then, I'm Omer, and this has been Omer 2020.